Chapter 19 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 19. After 5 years. The quiet days grew into weeks and months, and even years, without any event to startle the little circle into the consciousness of the lapse of time. One who had known them at the date of Ruth's becoming a governess in Mr. Bradshaw's family, and had been absent until the time of which I am now going to tell you, would have noted some changes which had imperceptibly come over all. But he too would have thought that the life which had brought so little of turmoil and vicissitude must have been calm and tranquil, and in accordance with the bygone activity of the town in which their existence passed away. The alterations that he would have perceived were those caused by the natural progress of time. The Benson home was brightened into vividness by the presence of the little Leonard, now a noble boy of 6, large and grand in limb and stature, and with a face of marked beauty and intelligence. Indeed, he might have been considered by many as too intelligent for his years, and often the living with old and thoughtful people gave him, beyond most children, the appearance of pondering over the mysteries which meet the young on the threshold of life, but which fade away as advancing years bring us more into contact with the practical and tangible, fade away and vanish, until it seems to require the agitation of some great storm of the soul before we can again realise spiritual things. But at times Leonard seemed oppressed and bewildered, after listening intent, with grave and wondering eyes, to the conversation around him. At others, the bright animal life shone forth radiant, and no 3 months' kitten, no foal, suddenly tossing up its heels by the side of its sedate dam, and careering around the pasture in pure mad enjoyment, no young creature of any kind could show more merriment and gladness of heart. "For ever in mischief" was Sally's account of him at such times; but it was not intentional mischief, and Sally herself would have been the first to scold any one else who had used the same words in reference to her darling. Indeed, she was once nearly giving warning because she thought the boy was being ill-used. The occasion was this. Leonard had for some time shown a strange, odd disregard of truth. He invented stories, and told them with so grave a face, that unless there was some internal evidence of their incorrectness, such as describing a cow with a bonnet on, he was generally believed, and his statements, which were given with the full appearance of relating a real occurrence, had once or twice led to awkward results. All the 3, whose hearts were pained by this apparent unconsciousness of the difference between truth and falsehood, were unaccustomed to children, or they would have recognised this as a stage through which most infants, who would have lively imaginations, pass; and accordingly there was a consultation in Mr. Benson's study one morning. Ruth was there, quiet, very pale, and with compressed lips, sick at heart as she heard Miss Benson's arguments for the necessity of whipping, in order to cure Leonard of his story-telling. Mr. Benson looked happy and uncomfortable. Education was but a series of experiments to them all, and they all had a secret dread of spoiling the noble boy, who was the darling of their hearts. And, perhaps, this very intensity of love begot an impatient, unnecessary anxiety, and made them resolve on sterner measures than the parent of a large family, where love was more spread abroad, would have dared to use. At any rate, the vote for whipping carried the day, and even Ruth, trembling and cold, agreed that it must be done. Only she asked, in a meek, sad voice, if she need be present. Mr Benson was to be the executioner, the scene the study, and being instantly told that she had better not, she went slowly and languidly up to her room, and kneeling down, she closed her ears and prayed. Miss Benson, having carried her point, was very sorry for the child, and would have begged him off, but Mr Benson had listened more to her arguments than now to her pleadings, and only answered, "If it is right, it shall be done." He went into the garden, and deliberately, almost as if he wished to gain time, chose and cut off a little switch from the laburnum tree. Then he returned through the kitchen, and gravely taking the awed and wondering little fellow by the hand, he led him silently into the study, and placing him before him, began an admonition on the importance of truthfulness, meaning to conclude with what he believed to be the moral of all punishment. "As you cannot remember this of yourself, I must give you a little pain to make you remember it. I am sorry it is necessary, and that you cannot recollect without my doing so." But before he had reached this very proper and desirable conclusion, and while he was yet working his way, his heart ached with the terrified look of the child at the solemnly sad face and words of upbraiding. Sally burst in. "And what may ye be going to do with that fine switch I saw ye gathering, Master Thurstan?" asked she, her eyes gleaming with anger at the answer she knew must come, if answer she had at all. "Go away, Sally," said Mr Benson, annoyed at the fresh difficulty in his path. "I'll not stir never a step till you give me that switch as you've got for some mischief, I'll be bound." "Sally, remember where it is said, 'He that spareth the rod spoileth the child,'" said Mr Benson, austerely. "Aye, I remember, and I remember a bit more than you want me to remember, I reckon. It were King Solomon as spoke them words, and it were King Solomon's son that were King Rehoboam, and no great shakes either. I can remember what is said on him, 2 Chronicles 12, chapter 14th verse. And he, that's King Rehoboam, the lad that tasted the rod, did evil, because he prepared not his heart to seek the Lord. I've not been reading my chapters every night for 50 year to be caught napping by a dissenter, neither," said she triumphantly. "Come along, Leonard." She stretched out her hand to the child, thinking that she had conquered. But Leonard did not stir. He looked wistfully at Mr Benson. "Come," said she impatiently. The boy's mouth quivered. "If you want to whip me, uncle, you may do it. I don't much mind." Put in this form, it was impossible to carry out his intentions, and so Mr Benson told the lad he might go, that he would speak to him another time. Leonard went away, more subdued in spirit than if he had been whipped. Sally lingered a moment. She stopped to add, "I think it's for them without sin to throw stones at a poor child, and cut up good laburnum branches to whip him. I only do as my betters do, when I call Leonard's mother Mrs Denbigh." The moment she had said this she was sorry. It was an ungenerous advantage after the enemy had acknowledged himself defeated. Mr Benson dropped his head upon his hands, and bid his face, and sighed deeply. Leonard flew in search of his mother, as in search of a refuge. If he had found her calm, he would have burst into a passion of crying after his agitation. As it was, he came upon her kneeling and sobbing, and he stood quite still. Then he threw his arms round her neck, and said, "Mamma, mamma, I will be good. I make a promise. I will speak true. I make a promise." And he kept his word. Miss Benson piqued herself upon being less carried away by her love for this child than anyone else in the house. She talked severely, and had capital theories, but her severity ended in talk, and her theories would not work. However, she read several books on education, knitting socks for Leonard all the while, and, upon the whole, I think the hands were more usefully employed than the head, and the good honest heart better than either. She looked older than when we first knew her, but it was a ripe, kindly age that was coming over her. Her excellent practical sense, perhaps, made her a more masculine character than her brother. He was often so much perplexed by the problems of life that he let the time for action go by, but she kept him in check by her clear pithy talk, which brought back his wandering thoughts to the duty that lay straight before him, waiting for action. And then he remembered that it was the faithful part to wait patiently upon God, and leave the ends in His hands, who alone knows why evil exists in this world, and why it ever hovers on either side of good. In this respect, Miss Benson had more faith than her brother, or so it seemed, for quick, resolute action in the next step of life was all she required, while he deliberated and trembled, and often did wrong from his very deliberation, when his first instinct would have led him right. But, although decided and prompt as ever, Miss Benson was grown older since the summer afternoon when she dismounted from the coach at the foot of the long Welsh hill that led to Llandau, where her brother awaited her to consult her about Ruth. Though her eye was as bright and straight-looking as ever, quick and brave in its glances, her hair had become almost snowy white, and it was on this point she consulted Sally, soon after the date of Leonard's last untruth. The two were arranging Miss Benson's room one morning, when, after dusting the looking-glass, she suddenly stopped in her operation, and, after a close inspection of herself, startled Sally by this speech: "Sally, I'm looking a great deal older than I used to." Sally, who was busy dilating on the increased price of flour, considered this remark of Miss Benson's as strangely irrelevant to the matter in hand, and only noticed it by a "To be sure, I suppose we all on us do, but 2 and 4 pence a dozen is too much to make us pay for it." Miss Benson went on with her inspection of herself, and Sally with her economical projects. "Sally," said Miss Benson, "my hair is nearly white. The last time I looked it was only pepper and salt. What must I do?" Why, what would the wench do?" asked Sally contemptuously. "You're never going to be taken in at your time of life by hair dyes and such gimcracks as can only take in young girls whose wisdom teeth are not cut." "And who are not very likely to want them," said Miss Benson quietly. "No, but you see, Sally, it's very awkward having such grey hair, and feeling so young. Do you know, Sally, I've as great a mind for dancing, when I hear a lively tune on the street organs, as ever, and as great a mind to sing when I'm happy to sing in my old way, Sally, you know." "Aye, you had it from a girl," said Sally, "and many a time when the door's been shut, I did not know if it was you in the parlour or a big bumblebee in the kitchen as was making that drumbling noise. I heard you at it yesterday." "But an old woman with grey hair ought not to have a fancy for dancing or singing," continued Miss Benson. "What nonsense are you talking?" said Sally, roused to indignation. "Calling yourself an old woman, when you're better than 10 years younger than me, and many a girl has grey hair at 25. "But I'm more than 25, Sally. I'm 57 next May." "More shame for ye, then, not to know better than to talk of dyeing your hair. I cannot abide such vanities." "Oh, dear Sally, when will you understand what I mean? I want to know how I'm to keep remembering how old I am, so as to prevent myself from feeling so young. I was quite startled just now to see my hair in the glass, for I can generally tell if my cap is straight by feeling. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll cut off a piece of my grey hair, and plait it together for a marker in my Bible." Miss Benson expected applause for this bright idea, but Sally only made answer, "You'll be taking to painting your cheeks next, now you've once thought of dyeing your hair." So Miss Benson plaited her grey hair in silence and quietness, Leonard holding one end of it while she wove it, and admiring the colour and texture all the time, with a sort of implied dissatisfaction at the auburn colour of his own curls, which was only half comforted away by Miss Benson's information that he lived long enough his hair would be like hers. Mr Benson, who had looked old and frail while he was yet but young, was now stationary as to the date of his appearance, but there was something more of nervous restlessness in his voice and ways than formerly. That was the only change 5 years had brought to him. And as for Sally, she chose to forget age and the passage of years altogether, and had as much work in her, to use her own expression, as she had at 16. Nor was her appearance very explicit as to the flight of time. 50, 60, or 70 she might be, not more than the last nor less than the first, though her usual answer to any circuitous inquiry as to her age was now, what it had been for many years past, "I'm feared I shall never see 30 again." Then, as to the house, it was not one where the sitting rooms are refurnished every 2 or 3 years, not now even, since Ruth came to share their living, a place where, as an article grew shabby or worn, a new one was purchased. The furniture looked poor, and the carpets almost threadbare. But there was such a dainty spirit of cleanliness abroad, such exquisite neatness of repair, and altogether so bright and cheerful a look about the rooms, everything so above board, no shifts to conceal poverty under flimsy ornament, that many a splendid drawing room would give less pleasure to those who could see evidence of character in inanimate things. But whatever poverty there might be in the house, there was full luxuriance in the little square, wall-encircled garden, on 2 sides of which the parlour and kitchen looked. The laburnum tree, which when Ruth came was like a twig stuck into the ground, was now a golden glory in spring, and a pleasant shade in summer. The wild hop that Mr Benson had brought home from one of his country rambles, and planted by the parlour window while Leonard was yet a baby in his mother's arms, was now a garland over the casement, hanging down long tendrils that waved in the breezes, and threw pleasant shadows and traceries, like some old bacchanalian carving, on the parlour walls, at morn or dusky eve. The yellow rose had clambered up to the window of Mr Benson's bedroom, and its blossom-laden branches were supported by a jargonelle pear tree rich in autumnal fruit. But perhaps in Ruth herself there was the greatest external change, for of the change which had gone on in her heart and mind and soul, or if there had been any, neither she or any one around her was conscious. But sometimes Miss Benson did say to Sally, "How very handsome Ruth is grown!" To which Sally made ungracious answer, "Yes, she's well enough. Beauty is deceitful, and favour a snare, and I'm thankful the Lord has spared me from such man traps and spring guns." But even Sally could not help secretly admiring Ruth. If her early brilliancy of colouring was gone, a clear ivory skin as smooth as satin told of complete and perfect health, and was as lovely, if not so striking in effect, as the banished lilies and roses. Her hair had grown darker and deeper in the shadow that lingered in its masses. Her eyes, even if you had guessed that they had shed bitter tears in their day, had a thoughtful, spiritual look about them that made you wonder at their depth, and look again. The increase of dignity in her face had been imparted to her form. I do not know if she had grown taller since the birth of her child, but she looked as if she had, and although she had lived in a very humble home, yet there was something about either it or her, or the people amongst whom she had been thrown during the last few years, which had so changed her, that whereas 6 or 7 years ago you would have perceived that she was not altogether a lady by birth and education, yet now she might have been placed among the highest in the land, and would have been taken by the most critical judge for their equal, although ignorant of their conventional etiquette, an ignorance which she would have acknowledged in a simple childlike way, being unconscious of any false shame. Her whole heart was in her boy. She often feared that she loved him too much, more than God himself, yet she could not bear to pray to have her love for her child lessened. But she would kneel down by his little bed at night, at the deep, still midnight, with the stars that kept watch over Rizpah shining down upon her, and tell God what I have now told you, that she feared and loved her child too much, yet could not, would not, love him less, and speak to him of her one treasure as she could speak to no earthly friend. And so, unconsciously, her love of her child led her up to love to God, to the all-knowing who read her heart. It might be superstition, I dare say it was, but somehow she never lay down to rest without saying, as she looked her last on her boy, "Thy will, not mine, be done." And even while she trembled and shrank with infinite dread from sounding the depths of what that will might be, she felt as if her treasure were more secure to waken up rosy and bright in the morning, as one over whose slumbers God's holy angels had watched, for the very words which she had turned away in sick terror from realising the night before. Her daily absence at her duties to the Bradshaw children only ministered to her love for Leonard. Everything does minister to love when its foundation lies deep in a true heart, and it was with exquisite pang of delight that after a moment of vague fear, "Oh, mercy to myself," I said, "if Lucy should be dead," she saw her child's bright face of welcome as he threw open the door every afternoon on her return home. For it was his silently appointed work to listen for her knock and rush breathless to let her in. If he were in the garden or upstairs among the treasures of the lumber room, either Miss Benson or her brother or Sally would fetch him to his happy little task. No one so sacred as he to the allotted duty. And the joyous meeting was not deadened by custom to either mother or child. Ruth gave the Bradshaws the highest satisfaction, as Mr Bradshaw often said both to her and to the Bensons. Indeed, she rather winced under his pompous approbation. But his favourite recreation was patronising, and when Ruth saw how quietly and meekly Mr Benson submitted to gifts and praise, when an honest word of affection, or a tacit implied acknowledgment of equality, would have been worth everything said and done, she tried to be more meek in spirit, and to recognise the good that undoubtedly existed in Mr Bradshaw. He was richer and more prosperous than ever, a keen, far-seeing man of business, with an undisguised contempt for all who failed in the success which he had achieved. But it was not alone those who were less fortunate in obtaining wealth than himself that he visited with severity of judgment. Every moral error or delinquency came under his unsparing comment. Stained by no vice himself, either in his own eyes or in that of any human being who cared to judge him. Having nicely and wisely proportioned and adapted his means to his ends, he could afford to speak and act with a severity which was almost sanctimonious in its ostentation or thankfulness as to himself. Not a misfortune or a sin was brought to light, but Mr Bradshaw could trace to its cause in some former mode of action, which he long ago foretold would lead to shame. If another's son turned out wild or bad, Mr Bradshaw had little sympathy. It might have been prevented by a stricter rule, or more religious life at home. Young Richard Bradshaw was quiet and steady, and other fathers might have had sons like him if they had taken the same pains to enforce obedience. Richard was an only son, and yet Mr Bradshaw might venture to say he had never had his own way in his life. Mrs Bradshaw was, he confessed. Mr Bradshaw did not like confessing his wife's errors. Rather less firm than he should have liked with the girls, and with some people, he believed, Jemima was rather headstrong, but to his wishes she had always shown herself obedient. All children were obedient if their parents were decided and authoritative, and every one would turn out well, if properly managed. If they did not prove good, then they might take the consequences of their errors. Mrs Bradshaw murmured faintly at her husband when his back was turned, but if his voice was heard, or his footsteps sounded in the distance, she was mute, and hurried her children into the attitude or action most pleasing to their father. Jemima, it is true, rebelled against this manner of proceeding, which savoured to her a little of deceit, but even she had not, as yet, overcome her awe of her father sufficiently to act independently of him, and according to her own sense of right, or rather, I should say, according to her own warm, passionate impulses. Before him, the wilfulness which made her dark eyes blaze out at times was hushed and still. He had no idea of her self-tormenting, no notion of the almost southern jealousy which seemed to belong to her brunette complexion. Jemima was not pretty. The flatness and shortness of her face made her almost plain. Yet most people looked twice at her expressive countenance, at the eyes which flamed or melted at every trifle, at the rich colour which came at every expressed emotion into her usually sallow face, at the faultless teeth which made her smile like a sunbeam. But then, again, when she thought she was not kindly treated, when a suspicion crossed her mind, or when she was angry with herself, her lips were tight pressed together, her colour was wan and almost livid, and a stormy gloom clouded her eyes as with a film. But before her father her words were few, and he did not notice looks or tones. Her brother Richard had been equally silent before his father in boyhood and early youth, but since he had gone to be a clerk in a London house, preparatory to assuming his place as junior partner in Mr Bradshaw's business, he spoke more on his occasional visits at home, and very proper and highly moral was his conversation, sentences of goodness, which were like the flowers that children stick in the ground, and that have not sprung upwards from roots, deep down in the hidden life and experience of the heart. He was as severe a judge as his father of other people's conduct, but you felt that Mr Bradshaw was sincere in his condemnation of all outward error and vice, and that he would try himself by the same laws as he tried others. Somehow Richard's words were frequently heard with a lurking distrust, and many shook their heads over the patterned son. But then it was those whose sons had gone astray, and had been condemned in no private or tender manner by Mr Bradshaw, so it might be revenge in them. Still, Jemima felt that all was not right. Her heart sympathised in the rebellion against his father's commands, which her brother had confessed to her in an unusual moment of confidence; but her uneasy conscience condemned the deceit which he had practised. The brother and sister were sitting alone over a blazing Christmas fire, and Jemima held an old newspaper in her hand to shield her face from the hot light. They were talking of family events, when, during a pause, Jemima's eye caught the name of a great actor, who had lately given prominence and life to a character in one of Shakespeare's plays. The criticism in the paper was fine, and warmed Jemima's heart. "How I should like to see a play!" exclaimed she. "Should you?" said her brother listlessly. "Yes, to be sure. Just hear this." And she began to read a fine passage of criticism. "Those newspaper people can make an article out of anything," said he, yawning. "I've seen the man myself, and it was all very well, but nothing to make such a fuss about." "Have you seen a play, Richard? Oh, why did you never tell me before? Tell me all about it. Why did you never name seeing in your letters?" He half smiled, contemptuously enough. "Oh, at first it strikes one rather, but after a while one cares no more for the theatre than one does for mince pies." "Oh, I wish I might go to London," said Jemima impatiently. "I've a great mind to ask papa to let me go to the George Smiths, and then I could see. I would not think him like mince pies." "You must not do any such thing," said Richard, now neither yawning nor contemptuous. "My father would never allow you to go to the theatre, and the George Smiths are such old fogies, they would be sure to tell." "How do you go, then? Does my father give you leave?" "Oh, many things are right for men which are not for girls." Jemima sat and pondered. Richard wished he had not been so confidential. "You need not name it," said he, rather anxiously. "Name what?" said she, startled, for her thoughts had gone far afield. "Oh, name my going once or twice to the theatre." "No, I shan't name it," said she. "No one here would care to hear it." But it was with some little surprise, and almost with a feeling of disgust, that she heard Richard join with her father in condemning someone, and add to Mr Bradshaw's list of offences by alleging that the young man was a playgoer. He did not think his sister heard his words. Mary and Elizabeth were the two girls whom Ruth had in charge. They resembled Jemima more than their brother in character. The household rules were occasionally a little relaxed in their favour, for Mary, the elder, was nearly 8 years younger than Jemima, and 3 intermediate children had died. They loved Ruth dearly, made a great pet of Leonard, and had many profound secrets together, most of which related to their wonders if Jemima and Mr Farquhar would ever be married. They watched their sister closely, and every day had some fresh confidence to make to each other, confirming or discouraging to their hopes. Ruth rose early, and shared the household work with Sally and Miss Benson till 7, and then she helped Leonard to dress, and had a quiet time alone with him till prayers and breakfast. At 9 she was to be at Mr Bradshaw's house. She sat in the room with Mary and Elizabeth during the Latin, the writing, and the arithmetic lessons which they received from masters. Then she read, and walked with them, clinging to her as to an elder sister. She dined with her pupils at the family lunch, and reached home by 4. That happy home, those quiet days. And so the peaceful days passed on into weeks, and months, and years, and Ruth and Leonard grew and strengthened into the riper beauty of their respective ages, while as yet no touch of decay had come on the quaint, primitive elders of the household. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 20. Jemima refuses to be managed. It was no wonder that the lookers-on were perplexed as to the state of affairs between Jemima and Mr Farquhar, for they too were sorely puzzled themselves at the sort of relationship between them. Was it love, or was it not? That was the question in Mr Farquhar's mind. He hoped it was not. He believed it was not, and yet he felt as if it were. There was something preposterous, he thought, in a man nearly 40 years of age being in love with a girl of 20. He had gone on reasoning, through all the days of his manhood, on the idea of a staid, noble-minded wife, grave and sedate, the fit companion in experience of her husband. He had spoken with admiration of reticent characters full of self-control and dignity, and he hoped, he trusted, that all this time he had not been allowing himself unconsciously to fall in love with a wild-hearted, impetuous girl, who knew nothing of life beyond her father's house, and who chafed under the strict discipline enforced there. For it was rather a suspicious symptom of the state of Mr Farquhar's affections, that he had discovered the silent rebellion which continued in Jemima's heart, unperceived by any of her own family, against the severe laws and opinions of her father. Mr Farquhar shared in these opinions, but in him they were modified and took a milder form. Still, he approved of much that Mr Bradshaw did and said, and this made it all the more strange that he should wince so for Jemima, whenever anything took place which he instinctively knew that she would dislike. After an evening at Mr Bradshaw's, when Jemima had gone to the very verge of questioning or disputing some of her father's severe judgments, Mr Farquhar went home in a dissatisfied, restless state of mind, which he was almost afraid to analyse. He admired the inflexible integrity, and almost the pomp of principle, evinced by Mr Bradshaw on every occasion. He wondered how it was that Jemima could not see how grand a life might be, whose every action was shaped in obedience to some eternal law, instead of which he was afraid she rebelled against every law, and was only guided by impulse. Mr Farquhar had been taught to dread impulses as promptings of the devil. Sometimes, if he tried to present her father's opinion before her in another form, so as to bring himself and her rather more into that state of agreement he longed for, she flashed out upon him with the indignation of difference that she dared not show to or before her father, as if she had some diviner instinct which taught her more truly than they knew, with all their experience. At least, in her first expressions there seemed something good and fine, but opposition made her angry and irritable, and the arguments which he was constantly provoking, whenever he was with her in her father's absence, frequently ended in some vehemence of expression on her part that offended Mr Farquhar, who did not see how she expiated her anger in tears and self-reproaches when alone in her chamber. Then he would lecture himself severely on the interest he could not help feeling in a wilful girl. He would determine not to interfere with her opinions in future, and yet, the very next time they differed, he strove to argue her into harmony with himself, in spite of all resolutions to the contrary. Mr Bradshaw saw just enough of this interest which Jemima had excited in his partner's mind to determine him in considering their future marriage as a settled affair. The fitness of the thing had long ago struck him. Her father's partner, so the fortune he meant to give her might continue in the business. A man of such steadiness of character, and such a capital eye for a desirable speculation as Mr Farquhar, just the right age to unite the paternal with the conjugal affection, and consequently the very man for Jemima, who had something unruly in her, which might break out under a regime less wisely adjusted to the circumstances than was Mr Bradshaw's, in his own opinion. A house ready furnished at a convenient distance from her home, no near relations on Mr Farquhar's side, who might be inclined to consider his residence as their own for an indefinite time, and so add to the household expenses. In short, what could be more suitable in every way? Mr Bradshaw respected the very self-restraint he thought he saw in Mr Farquhar's demeanour, attributing it to a wise desire to wait until trade should be rather more slack, and the man of business more at leisure to become the lover. As for Jemima, at times she thought she almost hated Mr Farquhar. "What business has he," she would think, "to lecture me? Often I can hardly bear it from papa, and I will not bear it from him. He treats me just like a child, and as if I should lose my present opinions when I know more of the world. I am sure I should like never to know the world, if it was to make me think as he does, hard man that he is. I wonder what made him take Jem Brown on as a gardener again, if he does not believe that above one criminal in 1,000 is restored to goodness. I'll ask him some day if that was not acting on impulse rather than principle. Poor impulse! How do you get abused? But I will tell Mr Farquhar. I will not let him interfere with me. If I do what papa bids me, no one has a right to notice whether I do it willingly or not." So then she tried to defy Mr Farquhar by doing and saying things that she knew he would disapprove. She went so far that he was seriously grieved, and did not even remonstrate and lecture. And then she was disappointed and irritated, for somehow, with all her indignation at interference, she liked to be lectured by him. Not that she was aware of this liking of hers, but still it would have been more pleasant to be scolded than so quietly passed over. Her two little sisters, with their wide-awake eyes, had long ago put things together and conjectured. Every day they had some fresh mystery together, to be imparted in garden walks and whispered talks. "Lizzie, did you see how the tears came into Mimi's eyes when Mr Farquhar looked so displeased when she said good people were always dull? I think she's in love." Mary said the last words with grave emphasis, and felt like an oracle of 12 years of age. "I don't," said Lizzie. "I know I cry often enough when papa is cross, and I'm not in love with him." "Yes, but you don't look as Mimi did." "Don't call her Mimi. You know papa does not like it." "Yes, but there are so many things papa does not like, I can never remember them all. Never mind about that, but listen to something I've got to tell you, if you'll never, never tell." "No, indeed I won't, Mary. What is it? Not to Mrs Denbigh?" "No, not even to Mrs Denbigh." "Well, then, the other day, last Friday, Mimi—" "Jemima," interrupted the more conscientious Elizabeth. "Jemima, if it must be so," jerked out Mary, "sent me to her desk for an envelope, and what do you think I saw?" "What?" asked Elizabeth, expecting nothing else than a red-hot valentine, signed Walter Farquhar, Pro Bradshaw, Farquhar and Company, in full. "Why, a piece of paper with dull-looking lines upon it, just like the scientific dialogues, and I remember all about it. It was once when Mr Farquhar had been telling us that a bullet does not go in a straight line, but in a something curve, and he drew some lines on a piece of paper, and Mimi—" "Jemima," put in Elizabeth. Well, she had treasured it up, and written in corner, "W.F. April 3rd. Now that's rather like love, is it not? For Jemima hates useful information just as much as I do, and that's saying a great deal; and yet she had kept this paper and dated it. If that's all, I know Dick keeps a paper with Miss Benson's name written on it, and yet he's not in love with her, and perhaps Jemima may like Mr Farquhar, and he may not like her. It seems such a little while since her hair was turned up, and he has always been a grave, middle-aged man ever since I can recollect. And then, have you never noticed how often he finds fault with her, almost lectures her?" "To be sure," said Mary, "but he may be in love, for all that. Just think how often papa lectures mamma, and yet, of course, they're in love with each other." "Well, we shall see," said Elizabeth. Poor Jemima little thought of the 4 sharp eyes that watched her daily course while she sat alone, as she fancied, with her secret in her own room. For, in a passionate fit of grieving at the impatient, hasty temper which had made her so seriously displease Mr Farquhar that he had gone away without remonstrance, without more leave taking than a distant bow, she had begun to suspect that, rather than not be noticed at all by him, rather than be an object of indifference to him, far rather would she be an object of anger and upbraiding; and the thoughts that followed this confession to herself stunned and bewildered her. For once that they made her dizzy with hope, 10 times they made her sick with fear. For an instant she planned to become and to be all he could wish her, to change her very nature for him. And then a great gush of pride came over her, and she set her teeth tight together, and determined that he should either love her as she was, or not at all. Unless he could take her with all her faults, she would not care for his regard. Love was too noble a word to call such cold calculating feeling as his must be, who went about with a pattern idea in his mind, trying to find a wife to match. Besides, there was something degrading, Jemima thought, in trying to alter herself to gain the love of any human creature. And yet, if he did not care for her, if this late indifference were to last, what a great shroud was drawn over life! Could she bear it? From the agony she dared not look at, but which she was going to risk encountering, she was aroused by the presence of her mother. "Jemima, your father wants to speak to you in the dining room." "What for?" asked the girl. "Oh, he is fidgeted by something Mr Farquhar said to me, and which I repeated. I am sure I thought there was no harm in it, and your father always likes me to tell him what everybody says in his absence." Jemima went with a heavy heart into her father's presence. He was walking up and down the room, and did not see her at first. "Oh, Jemima, is that you? Has your mother told you what I want to speak to you about?" "No," said Jemima, "not exactly." "She has been telling me, what proves to me how very seriously you must have displeased and offended Mr Farquhar, before he could have expressed himself to her as he did when he left the house. You know what he said?" "No," said Jemima, her heart swelling within her. "He has no right to say anything about me." She was desperate, or she durst not have said this before her father. "No right! What do you mean, Jemima?" said Mr Bradshaw, turning sharp round. "Surely you must know that I hope he may one day be your husband; that is to say, if you prove yourself worthy of the excellent training I have given you. I cannot suppose Mr Farquhar would take any undisciplined girl as a wife." Jemima held tight by a chair near which she was standing. She did not speak. Her father was pleased by her silence. It was the way in which he liked his projects to be received. "But you cannot suppose," he continued, "that Mr Farquhar will consent to marry you?" "Consent to marry me!" repeated Jemima in a low tone of brooding indignation. Were those the terms upon which her rich woman's heart was to be given, with a calm consent of acquiescent acceptance, but a little above resignation on the part of the receiver? If you give way to a temper which, although you have never dared to show it to me, I am well aware exists, although I hope the habits of self-examination I had instilled had done much to cure you of manifesting it. At one time, Richard promised to be the more headstrong of the two. Now I must desire you to take pattern by him. Yes," he continued, falling into his old train of thought, "it would be a most fortunate connection for you in every way. I should have you under my own eye, and could still assist you in the formation of your character, and I should be at hand to strengthen and confirm your principles. Mr. Farquhar's connection with the firm would be convenient and agreeable to me in a pecuniary point of view. Mr. Bradshaw was going on in his enumeration of the advantages which he in particular, and Jemima in the second place, would derive from this marriage, when his daughter spoke, at first so low that he could not hear her, as he walked up and down the room with his creaking boots, and he had to stop to listen. "Has Mr. Farquhar ever spoken to you about it?" Jemima's cheek was flushed as she asked the question. She wished that she might have been the person to whom he had first addressed himself. Mr. Bradshaw answered, "No, not spoken. It has been implied between us for some time. At least, I have been so aware of his intentions that I have made several allusions in the course of business to it as a thing that might take place. He can hardly have misunderstood. He must have seen that I perceived his design and approved of it," said Mr. Bradshaw, rather doubtfully, as he remembered how very little, in fact, passed between him and his partner which could have reference to the subject, to any but a mind prepared to receive it. Perhaps Mr. Farquhar had not really thought of it, but then again that would imply that his own penetration had been a thing not impossible certainly, but quite beyond the range of probability. So he reassured himself, and, as he thought, his daughter, by saying, "The whole thing is so suitable, the advantages arising from the connection are so obvious. Besides which, I am quite aware, from many little speeches of Mr. Farquhar's, that he contemplates marriage at no very distant time. And he seldom leaves Eccleston, and visits few families besides our own, certainly none that compare with ours in the advantages you have all received in moral and religious training." But then Mr. Bradshaw was checked in his implied praises of himself, and only himself could be his martingale when he once set out on such a career, by a recollection that Jemima must not feel too secure, as she might become if he dwelt too much on the advantages of her being her father's daughter. Accordingly he said, "But you must be aware, Jemima, that you do very little credit to the education I have given you when you make such an impression as you must have done to-day, before Mr. Farquhar could have said what he did of you." "What did he say?" asked Jemima, still in the low husky tone of suppressed anger. "Your mother says he remarked to her, 'What a pity it is that Jemima cannot maintain her opinions without going into a passion, and what a pity it is that her opinions are such as to sanction rather than curb these fits of rudeness and anger.'" "Did he say that?" said Jemima, in a still lower tone, not questioning her father, but speaking rather to herself. "I have no doubt he did," replied her father gravely. "Your mother is in the habit of repeating accurately to me what takes place in my absence. Besides which, the whole speech is not one of hers. She has not altered a word in the repetition, I am convinced. I have trained her to habits of accuracy very unusual in a woman." At another time Jemima might have been inclined to rebel against this system of carrying constant intelligence to headquarters, which she had long ago felt as an insurmountable obstacle to any free communication with her mother. But now her father's means of acquiring knowledge faded into insignificance before the nature of the information he imparted. She stood quite still, grasping the chair back, longing to be dismissed. "I have said enough now, I hope, to make you behave in a becoming manner to Mr Farquhar. If your temper is too unruly to be always under your own control, at least have respect to my injunctions, and take some pains to curb it before him." "May I go?" asked Jemima, chafing more and more. "You may," said her father. When she left the room, he gently rubbed his hands together, satisfied with the effect he had produced, and wondering how it was that one so well brought up as his daughter could ever say or do anything to provoke such a remark from Mr Farquhar as that which he heard repeated. "Nothing can be more gentle and docile than she is when spoken to in the proper manner. I must give Farquhar a hint," said Mr Bradshaw to himself. Jemima rushed upstairs and locked herself into her room. She began pacing up and down at first, without shedding a tear, but then she suddenly stopped, and burst out crying with passionate indignation. "So I am to behave well, not because it is right, but to show off before Mr Farquhar. Oh, Mr Farquhar," said she, suddenly changing to a sort of upbraiding tone of voice, "I did not think so of you an hour ago. I did not think you could choose a wife in that cold-hearted way, though you did profess to act by rule and line. But you think to have me, do you? Because it is fitting and suitable? And do you want to be married, and can't spare time for wooing?" She was lashing herself up by an exaggeration of all her father had said. "And how often I have thought you were too grand for me, but now I know better. Now I can believe that all you do is done from calculation. You are good because it adds to your business credit. You talk in that high strain about principle because it sounds well, and is respectable. And even these things are better than your cold way of looking out for a wife, just as you would do for a carpet, to add to your comforts and settle you respectably. But I won't be that wife. You shall see something of me which shall make you not acquiesce so quietly in the arrangements of the firm." She cried too vehemently to go on thinking or speaking. Then she stopped and said, "Only an hour ago I was hoping, I don't know what I was hoping, but I thought, oh, how I was deceived! I thought he had a true, deep, loving, manly heart, which God might let me win, but now I know he has only a calm, calculating head." If Jemima had been vehement and passionate before this conversation with her father, it was better than the sullen reserve she assumed now whenever Mr Farquhar came to the house. He felt it deeply. No reasoning with himself took off the pain he experienced. He tried to speak on the subjects she liked, in the manner she liked, until he despised himself for the unsuccessful efforts. He stood between her and her father once or twice, in obvious inconsistency with his own previously expressed opinions, and Mr Bradshaw piqued himself upon his admirable management, in making Jemima feel that she owed his indulgence or forbearance to Mr Farquhar's interference. But Jemima, perverse, miserable Jemima, thought that she hated Mr Farquhar all the more. She respected her father inflexible much more than her father pompously giving up to Mr Farquhar's subdued remonstrances on her behalf. Even Mr Bradshaw was perplexed, and shut himself up to consider how Jemima was to be made more fully to understand his wishes and her own interests. But there was nothing to take hold of as a ground for any further conversation with her. Her actions were so submissive that they were spiritless. She did all her father desired. She did it with a nervous quickness and haste. If she thought that otherwise Mr Farquhar would interfere in any way, she wished evidently to owe nothing to him. She had begun by leaving the room when he came in, after the conversation she had had with her father, but at Mr Bradshaw's first expression of his wish that she should remain, she remained, silent, indifferent, inattentive to all that was going on. At least there was this appearance of inattention. She would work away at her sewing as if she were to earn her livelihood by it. The light was gone out of her eyes as she lifted them up heavily before replying to any question, and the eyelids were often swollen with crying. But in all this there was no positive fault. Mr Bradshaw could not have told her not to do this, or to do that, without her doing it, for she had become much more docile of late. It was a wonderful proof of the influence Ruth had gained in the family, that Mr Bradshaw, after much deliberation, congratulated himself on the wise determination he had made of requesting her to speak to Jemima, and find out what feeling was at the bottom of all this change in her ways of going on. He rang the bell. "Is Mrs Denbigh here?" he inquired of the servant who answered it. "Yes, sir, she has just come." "Beg her to come to me in this room as soon as she can leave the young ladies." Ruth came. "Sit down, Mrs Denbigh, sit down. I want to have a little conversation with you. Not about your pupils. They are going on well under your care, I am sure, and I often congratulate myself on the choice I made. I assure you I do. But now I want to speak to you about Jemima. She is very fond of you, and perhaps you could take an opportunity of observing to her, in short, of saying to her, that she is behaving very foolishly, in fact, disgusting Mr Farquhar, who was, I know, inclined to like her, by the sullen, sulky way she behaves in when he is by." He paused for the ready acquiescence he expected, but Ruth did not quite comprehend what was required of her, and disliked the glimpse she had gained of the task very much. "I hardly understand, sir. You are displeased with Miss Bradshaw's manners to Mr Farquhar?" Well, not quite that. I am displeased with her manners. They are sulky and abrupt, particularly when he is by, and I want you, of whom she is so fond, to speak to her about it." "But I have never had the opportunity of noticing them. Whenever I have seen her, she has been most gentle and affectionate." "But I think you do not hesitate to believe me when I say that I have noticed the reverse," said Mr Bradshaw, drawing himself up. "No, sir. I beg your pardon if I have expressed myself so badly as to seem to doubt. But am I to tell Miss Bradshaw that you have spoken of her faults to me?" asked Ruth, a little astonished, and shrinking more than ever from the proposed task. "If you would allow me to finish what I have got to say, without interruption, I could tell you what I do wish." "I beg your pardon, sir," said Ruth gently. "I wish you to join our circle occasionally in an evening. Mrs Bradshaw shall send you an invitation when Mr Farquhar is likely to be here. Warned by me, and consequently with your observation quickened, you can hardly fail to notice instances of what I had pointed out, and then I will trust to your own good sense." Mr Bradshaw bowed to her at this part of his sentence, "to find an opportunity to remonstrate with her." Ruth was beginning to speak, but he waved his hand for another minute of silence. "Only a minute, Mrs Denbigh. I am quite aware that in requesting your presence occasionally in the evening, I shall be trespassing upon the time which is, in fact, your money. you may be assured that I shall not forget this little circumstance, and you can explain what I have said on this head to Benson and his sister." "I am afraid I cannot do it," Ruth began; but while she was choosing words delicate enough to express her reluctance to act as he wished, he had almost bowed her out of the room, and thinking that she was modest in her estimate of her qualifications for remonstrating with his daughter, he added blandly: "No one so able, Mrs Denbigh. I have observed many qualities in you observed when, perhaps, you have little thought it." If he had observed Ruth that morning, he would have seen an absence of mind and depression of spirits not much to her credit as a teacher, for she could not bring herself to feel that she had any right to go into the family purposely to watch over and find fault with any one member of it. If she had seen anything wrong in Jemima, Ruth loved her so much that she would have told her of it in private, and with many doubts how far she was the one to pull out the mote from anyone's eye, even in the most tender manner. She would have had to conquer reluctance before she could have done even this. But there was something indefinably repugnant to her in the manner of acting which Mr Bradshaw had proposed, and she determined not to accept the invitations which were to place her in so false a position. But as she was leaving the house, after the end of the lessons, while she stood in the hall tying on her bonnet, and listening to the last small confidences of her two pupils, she saw Jemima coming in through the garden door, and was struck by the change in her looks. The large eyes, so brilliant once, were dim and clouded; the complexion sallow and colourless; a lowering expression was on the dark brow, and the corners of her mouth drooped as with sorrowful thoughts. She looked up, and her eyes met Ruth's. "Oh, you beautiful creature!" thought Jemima, "with your still, calm, heavenly face, what are you to know of earth's trials? You have lost your beloved by death, but that is a blessed sorrow. The sorrow I have pulls me down and down, and makes me despise and hate every one. Not you, though." And her face changing to a soft, tender look, she went up to Ruth and kissed her fondly, as if it were a relief to be near some one on whose true, pure heart she relied. Ruth returned the caress, and even while she did so, she suddenly rescinded her resolution to keep clear of what Mr Bradshaw had desired her to do. On her way home she resolved, if she could, to find out what were Jemima's secret feelings, and as if from some previous knowledge she suspected they were morbid and exaggerated in any way, to try and help her right with all the wisdom which true love gives. It was time that someone should come to still the storm in Jemima's turbulent heart, which was daily and hourly knowing less and less of peace. The irritating difficulty was to separate the two characters, which at two different times she had attributed to Mr Farquhar: the old one, which she had formerly believed to be true, that he was a man acting up to a high standard of lofty principle, and acting up without a struggle; and this last had been the circumstance which had made her rebellious and irritable once. The new one, which her father had excited in her suspicious mind, that Mr Farquhar was cold and calculating in all he did, and that she was to be transferred by the former, and accepted by the latter, as a sort of stock in trade. These were the two Mr Farquhars who clashed together in her mind; and in this state of irritation and prejudice, she could not bear the way in which he gave up his opinions to please her. That was not the way to win her. She liked him far better when he inflexibly and rigidly adhered to his idea of right and wrong, not even allowing any force to temptation, and hardly any grace to repentance, compared with that beauty of holiness which had never yielded to sin. He had been her idol in those days, as she found out now, however much at the time she had opposed him with violence. As for Mr Farquhar, he was almost weary of himself. No reasoning, even no principle, seemed to have influence over him, for he saw that Jemima was not at all what he approved of in woman. He saw her uncurbed and passionate, affecting to despise the rules of life he held most sacred, and indifferent to, if not positively disliking, him, and yet he loved her dearly. But he resolved to make a great effort of will, and break loose from these trammels of sense; and while he resolved, some old recollection would bring her up, hanging on his arm, in all the confidence of early girlhood, looking up in his face with her soft dark eyes, and questioning him upon the mysterious subjects which had so much interest for both of them at that time, although they had become only matter for dissension in these later days. It was also true, as Mr Bradshaw had said, Mr Farquhar wished to marry, and had not much choice in the small town of Eccleston. He never put this so plainly before himself as a reason for choosing Jemima, as her father had done to her, but it was an unconscious motive all the same. However, now he had lectured himself into the resolution to make a pretty long absence from Eccleston, and see if, amongst his distant friends, there was no woman more in accordance with his ideal, who could put the naughty, wilful, plaguing Jemima Bradshaw out of his head, if he did not soon perceive some change in her for the better. A few days after Ruth's conversation with Mr Bradshaw, the invitation she had been expecting, yet dreading, came. It was to her alone. Mr and Miss Benson were pleased at the compliment to her, and urged her acceptance of it. She wished that they had been included. She had not thought it right or kind to Jemima to tell them why she was going, and she feared now lest they should feel a little hurt that they were not asked too. But she need not have been afraid. They were glad and proud of this attention to her, and never thought of themselves. "Ruthie, what gown shall you wear to night? Your dark grey one, I suppose?" asked Miss Benson. "Yes, I suppose so. I never thought of it, but that is my best." "Well, then, I shall quill up a ruff for you. You know I am a famous quiller of net." Ruth came downstairs with a little flush on her cheeks when she was ready to go. She held her bonnet and shawl in her hand, for she knew Miss Benson and Sally would want to see her dressed. "Is not mamma pretty?" asked Leonard, with a child's pride. "She looks very nice and tidy," said Miss Benson, who had an idea that children should not talk or think about beauty. "I think my ruff looks so nice," said Ruth, with gentle pleasure. And indeed it did look nice, and set off the pretty round throat most becomingly. Her hair, now grown long and thick, was smoothed as close to her head as its waving nature would allow, and plaited up in a great rich knot low down behind. The grey gown was as plain could be. "You should have light gloves, Ruth," said Miss Benson. She went upstairs, and brought down a delicate pair of Limerick ones, which had been long treasured up in a walnut shell. "They say them gloves is made of chicken skins," said Sally, examining them curiously. "I wonder how they set about skinning 'em." "Here, Ruth," said Mr Benson, coming in from the garden. "Here's a rose or two for you. I am sorry there are no more. I hoped I should have had my yellow rose out by this time, but the damask and the white are in a warmer corner, and have got the start." Miss Benson and Leonard stood at the door, and watched her down the little passage street till she was out of sight. She had hardly touched the bell at Mr Bradshaw's door, when Mary and Elizabeth opened it with boisterous glee. "We saw you coming. We've been watching for you. We want you to come round the garden before tea. Papa is not come in yet. Do come." She went round the garden with a little girl clinging to each arm. It was full of sunshine and flowers, and this made the contrast between it and the usual large family room, which fronted the north east, and therefore had no evening sun to light up its cold drab furniture, more striking than usual. It looked very gloomy. There was the great dining table, heavy and square; the range of chairs, straight and square; the work boxes, useful and square; the colouring of walls and carpets and curtains, all of the coldest description. Everything was handsome, and everything was ugly. Mrs Bradshaw was asleep in her easy chair when they came in. Jemima had just put down her work, and, lost in thought, she leaned her cheek on her hand. When she saw Ruth, she brightened a little, and went to her and kissed her. Mrs Bradshaw jumped up at the sound of their entrance, and was wide awake in a moment. "Oh, I thought your father was here," said she, evidently relieved to find that he had not come in and caught her sleeping. "Thank you, Mrs Denbigh, for coming to us to night," said she, in the quiet tone in which she generally spoke in her husband's absence. When he was there, a sort of constant terror of displeasing him made her voice sharp and nervous. The children knew that many a thing passed over by their mother when their father was away was sure to be noticed by her when he was present, and noticed, too, in a cross and querulous manner, for she was so much afraid of the blame which, on any occasion of their misbehaviour, fell upon her. And yet she looked up to her husband with a reverence and regard, and a faithfulness of love, which his decision of character was likely to produce on a weak and anxious mind. He was a rest and a support to her, on whom she cast all her responsibilities. She was an obedient, unremonstrating wife to him. No stronger affection had ever brought her duty into conflict with any desire of her heart. She loved her children dearly, though they all perplexed her very frequently. Her son was her especial darling, because he very seldom brought her into any scrapes with his father. He was so cautious and prudent, and had the art of keeping a calm soul about any difficulty he might be in. With all her dutiful sense of the obligation which her husband enforced upon her, to notice and tell him everything that was going wrong in the household, and especially among his children, Mrs Bradshaw somehow contrived to be honestly blind to a good deal that was not praiseworthy in Master Richard. Mr Bradshaw came in before long, bringing with him Mr Farquhar. Jemima had been talking to Ruth with some interest before then, but on seeing Mr Farquhar, she bent her head down over her work, went a little paler, and then turned obstinately silent. Mr Bradshaw longed to command her to speak, but even he had a suspicion that what she might say, when so commanded, might be rather worse in its effect than her gloomy silence, so he held his peace, and a discontented, angry kind of peace it was. Mrs Bradshaw saw that something was wrong, but could not tell what. Only she became every moment more trembling and nervous and irritable, and sent Mary and Elizabeth off on all sorts of contradictory errands to the servants, and made the tea twice as strong, and sweetened it twice as much as usual, in hopes of pacifying her husband with good things. Mr Farquhar had gone for the last time, or so he thought. He had resolved, for the 5th time, that he would go and watch Jemima once more, and if her temper got the better of her, and she showed the old sullenness again, and gave the old proofs of indifference to his good opinion, he would give her up altogether, and seek a wife elsewhere. He sat watching her with folded arms, and in silence. Altogether, they were a pleasant family party. Jemima wanted to wind a skein of wool. Mr Farquhar saw it, and came to her, anxious to do her this little service. She turned away pettishly, and asked Ruth to hold it for her. Ruth was hurt from Mr Farquhar, and looked sorrowfully at Jemima, but Jemima would not see her glance of upbraiding, as Ruth, hoping that she would relent, delayed a little to comply with her request. Mr Farquhar did, and went back to his seat to watch them both. He saw Jemima, turbulent and stormy in look. He saw Ruth, to all appearance heavenly calm as the angels, or with only that little tinge of sorrow which her friend's behaviour had called forth. He saw the unusual beauty of her face and form, which he had never noticed before, and he saw Jemima, with all the brilliancy she once possessed in eyes and complexion, dimmed and faded. He watched Ruth, speaking low and soft to the little girls, who seemed to come to her in every difficulty, and he remarked her gentle firmness when their bedtime came, and they pleaded to stay up longer. Their father was absent in his counting house, or they would not have dared to do so. He liked Ruth's soft, distinct, unwavering, "No, you must go, you must keep to what is right," far better than the good-natured yielding to entreaty he had formerly admired in Jemima. He was wandering off into this comparison, while Ruth, with delicate and unconscious tact, was trying to lead Jemima into some subject which should take her away from the thoughts, whatever they were, that made her so ungracious and rude. Jemima was ashamed of herself before Ruth, in a way which she had never been before any one else. She valued Ruth's good opinion so highly, that she dreaded lest her friend should perceive her faults. She put a check upon herself, a check at first, but after a little time she had forgotten something of her trouble, and listened to Ruth, and questioned her about Leonard, and smiled at his little witticisms, and only the sighs that would come up from the very force of habit brought back the consciousness of her unhappiness. Before the end of the evening, Jemima had allowed herself to speak to Mr Farquhar in the old way, questioning, differing, disputing. She was recalled to the remembrance of that miserable conversation by the entrance of her father. After that she was silent, but he had seen her face more animated, and bright with a smile, as she spoke to Mr Farquhar, and although he regretted the loss of her complexion, for she was still very pale, he was highly pleased with the success of his project. He never doubted but that Ruth had given her some sort of private exhortation to behave better. He could not have understood the pretty art with which, by simply banishing unpleasant subjects, and throwing a wholesome, natural, sunlit tone over others, Ruth had insensibly drawn Jemima out of her gloom. He resolved to buy Mrs Denbigh a handsome silk gown the very next day. He did not believe she had a silk gown, poor creature. He had noticed that dark grey stuff this long time as her Sunday dress. He liked the colour; the silk one should be just the same tinge. Then he thought that it would perhaps be better to choose a lighter shade, one which might be noticed as different to the old gown, for he had no doubt she would like to have it remarked, and perhaps would not object to tell people that it was a present from Mr Bradshaw, a token of his approbation. He smiled a little to himself as he thought of this additional source of pleasure to Ruth. She, in the meantime, was getting up to go home. While Jemima was lighting the bed candle at the lamp, Ruth came round to bid good night. Mr Bradshaw could not allow her to remain till the morrow, uncertain whether he was satisfied or not. "Good night, Mrs Denbigh," said he. "Good night. Thank you. I am obliged to you. I am exceedingly obliged to you." He laid emphasis on these words, for he was pleased to see Mr Farquhar step forward to help Jemima in her little office. Mr Farquhar offered to accompany Ruth home, but the streets that intervened between Mr Bradshaw's and the Chapel House were so quiet that he desisted, when he learned from Ruth's manner how much she disliked his proposal. Mr Bradshaw, too, instantly observed, "Oh, Mrs Denbigh need not trouble you, Farquhar. I have servants at liberty at any moment to attend to her if she wishes it." In fact, he wanted to make hay while the sun shone, and to detain Mr Farquhar a little longer, now that Jemima was so gracious. She went upstairs with Ruth to help her put on her things. "Dear Jemima," said Ruth, "I am so glad to see you looking better to night. You quite frightened me this morning, you looked so ill." "Did I?" replied Jemima. "Oh, Ruth, I have been so unhappy lately. I want you to come and put me to rights," she continued, half smiling. "You know I'm a sort of out pupil of yours, though we are so nearly of an age. You ought to lecture me, and make me good." "Should I, dear?" said Ruth. "I don't think I'm the one to do it." "Oh, yes, you are. You've done me good to night." "Well, if I can do anything for you, tell me what it is," asked Ruth tenderly. "Oh, not now, not now," replied Jemima. "I could not tell you here. It's a long story, and I don't know that I can tell you at all. Mamma might come up at any moment, and papa would be sure to ask what we had been talking about so long." "Take your own time, love," said Ruth. "Only remember, as far as I can, how glad I am to help you." "You're too good, my darling," said Jemima fondly. "Don't say so," replied Ruth earnestly, almost as if she were afraid. "God knows I am not." "Well, we're none of us too good," answered Jemima. "I know that. But you are very good. Nay, I won't call you so if it makes you look so miserable. But come away downstairs." With the fragrance of Ruth's sweetness lingering about her, Jemima was her best self during the next half hour. Mr Bradshaw was more and more pleased, and raised the price of the silk which he was going to give to Ruth, 6 pence a yard during the time. Mr Farquhar went home through the garden way, happier than he had been this long time. He even caught himself humming the old refrain: "On revient toujours à ses premiers amours." But as soon as he was aware of what he was doing, he cleared away the remnants of the song into a cough, which was sonorous, if not perfectly real. Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 21. Mr Farquhar's attentions transferred. The next morning, as Jemima and her mother sat at their work, it came into the head of the former to remember her father's very marked way of thanking Ruth the evening before. "What a favourite Mrs Denbigh is with papa!" said she. "I am sure I don't wonder at it. Did you notice, mamma, how he thanked her for coming here last night?" "Yes, dear, but I don't think it was all." Mrs Bradshaw stopped short. She was never certain if it was right or wrong to say anything. "Not at all what?" asked Jemima, when she saw her mother was not going to finish the sentence. "Not all because Mrs Denbigh came to tea here," replied Mrs Bradshaw. "Why, what else could he be thanking her for? What has she done?" asked Jemima, stimulated to curiosity by her mother's hesitating manner. "I don't know if I ought to tell you," said Mrs Bradshaw. "Oh, very well," said Jemima, rather annoyed. "Nay, dear, your papa never said I was not to tell. Perhaps I may." "Never mind, I don't want to hear," in a piqued tone. There was silence for a while. Jemima was trying to think of something else, but her thoughts would revert to the wonder what Mrs Denbigh could have done for her father. "I think I may tell you, though," said Mrs Bradshaw, half questioning. Jemima had the honour not to urge any confidence, but she was too curious to take any active step towards repressing it. Mrs Bradshaw went on: "I think you deserve to know. It is partly your doing that papa is so pleased with Mrs Denbigh. He is going to buy her a silk gown this morning, and I think you ought to know why." "Why?" asked Jemima. "Because papa is so pleased to find that you mind what she says." "I mind what she says? To be sure I do, and always did. But why should papa give her a gown for that? I think he ought to give it me, rather," said Jemima, half laughing. "I am sure he would, dear. He will give you one, I am certain, if you want one. He was so pleased to see you like your old self to Mr Farquhar last night, We neither of us could think what had come over you this last month, but now all seems right." A dark cloud came over Jemima's face. She did not like this close observation and constant comment on her manners, and what had Ruth to do with it? "I am glad you were pleased," said she, very coldly. Then, after a pause, she added, "But you have not told me what Mrs Denbigh had to do with my good behaviour." "Did she not speak to you about it?" asked Mrs Bradshaw, looking up. "No. Why should she? She has no right to criticise what I do. She would not be so impertinent," said Jemima, feeling very uncomfortable and suspicious. "Yes, love, she would have had a right, for papa had desired her to do it." "Papa desired her! What do you mean, mamma?" "Oh, dear! I dare say I should not have told you," said Mrs Bradshaw, perceiving from Jemima's tone of voice that something had gone wrong. "Only you spoke as if it would be impertinent in Mrs Denbigh, and I am sure she would not do anything that was impertinent. You know, it would be but right for her to do what papa told her; and he said a great deal to her the other day about finding out why you were so cross, and bringing you right. And you are right now, dear," said Mrs Bradshaw, soothingly, thinking that Jemima was annoyed, like a good child, at the recollection of how naughty she had been. "Then papa is going to give Mrs Denbigh a gown because I was civil to Mr Farquhar last night?" "Yes, dear," said Mrs Bradshaw, more and more frightened at Jemima's angry manner of speaking, low toned, but very indignant. Jemima remembered, with smouldered anger, Ruth's pleading way of willing her from her sullenness the night before. Management everywhere, but in this case it was peculiarly revolting, so much so that she could hardly bear to believe that the seemingly transparent Ruth had lent herself to it. "Are you sure, mamma, that papa asked Mrs Denbigh to make me behave differently? It seems so strange." "I am quite sure. He spoke to her last Friday morning in the study. I remember it was Friday, because Mrs Dean was working here." Jemima remembered now that she had gone into the schoolroom on the Friday, and had found her sisters lounging about, and wondering what papa could possibly want with Mrs Denbigh. After this conversation, Jemima repulsed all Ruth's timid efforts to ascertain the cause of her disturbance, and to help her if she could. Ruth's tender, sympathising manner, as she saw Jemima daily looking more wretched, was distasteful to the latter in the highest degree. She could not say that Mrs Denbigh's conduct was positively wrong. It might even be quite right, but it was inexpressibly repugnant to her to think of her father consulting with a stranger. A week ago she almost considered Ruth as a sister. How to manage his daughter, so as to obtain the end he wished for; yes, even if that end was for her own good. She was thankful and glad to see a brown paper parcel lying on the hall table, with a note in Ruth's handwriting addressed to her father. She knew what it was, the grey silk dress, that she was sure Ruth would never accept. No one henceforward could induce Jemima to enter into conversation with Mr Farquhar. She suspected manoeuvring in the simplest actions, and was miserable in this constant state of suspicion. She would not allow herself to like Mr Farquhar, even when he said things the most after her own heart. She heard him one evening talking with her father about the principles of trade. Her father stood out for the keenest, sharpest work, consistent with honesty. If he had not been her father, she would perhaps have thought some of his sayings inconsistent with true Christian honesty. He was for driving hard bargains, exacting interest, and payment of just bills to a day. That was, he said, the only way in which trade could be conducted. Once allow a margin of uncertainty, or where feelings instead of maxims were to be the guide, and all hope of their ever being any good men of business was ended. Suppose a delay of a month in requiring payment might save a man's credit, prevent his becoming a bankrupt, put in Mr Farquhar. I would not give it him. I would let him have money to set up again as soon as he had passed the bankruptcy court. If he never passed, I might, in some cases, make him an allowance, but I would always keep my justice and my charity separate. And yet charity, in your sense of the word, degrades. Justice, tempered with mercy and consideration, elevates. That is not justice. Justice is certain and inflexible. No, Mr Farquhar, you must not allow any quixotic notions to mingle with your conduct as a tradesman." And so they went on, Jemima's face glowing with sympathy in all Mr Farquhar said, till once, on looking up suddenly with sparkling eyes, she saw a glance of her father's, which told her, as plain as words can say, that he was watching the effect of Mr Farquhar's speeches upon his daughter. She was chilled thenceforward. She thought her father prolonged the argument, in order to call out those sentiments which he knew would most recommend his partner to his daughter. She would so fain have let herself love Mr Farquhar, but this constant manoeuvring, in which she did not feel clear that he did not take a passive part, made her sick at heart. She even wished that they might not go through the form of pretending to try to gain her consent to the marriage, if it involved all this premeditated action and speech making, such moving about of every one into their right places, like pieces at chess. She felt as if she would rather be bought openly, like an Oriental daughter, where no one is degraded in their own eyes by being parties to such a contract. The consequence of all this admirable management of Mr Bradshaw's would have been very unfortunate to Mr Farquhar, who was innocent of all connivance in any of the plots; indeed, would have been as much annoyed at them as Jemima, had he been aware of them. But that the impression made upon him by Ruth on the evening I have so lately described was deepened by the contrast which her behaviour made to Miss Bradshaw's on one or two more recent occasions. There was no use, he thought, in continuing attentions so evidently distasteful to Jemima. To her, a young girl hardly out of the schoolroom, he probably appeared like an old man, and he might even lose the friendship with which she used to regard him, and which was, and ever would be, very dear to him if he persevered in trying to be considered as a lover. He should always feel affectionately towards her. Her very faults gave her an interest in his eyes, for which he had blamed himself most conscientiously and most uselessly when he was looking upon her as his future wife, but which the said conscience would learn to approve of when she sank down to the place of a young friend over whom he might exercise a good and salutary interest. Mrs Denbigh, if not many months older in years, had known sorrow and cares so early that she was much older in character. Besides, her shy reserve, and her quiet daily walk within the lines of duty, were much in accordance with Mr Farquhar's notion of what a wife should be. Still, it was a wrench to take his affections away from Jemima. If she had not helped him to do so by every means in her power, he could never have accomplished it. Yes, by every means in her power had Jemima alienated her lover, her beloved, for so he was in fact. And now her quick-sighted eyes saw he was gone for ever, past recall; for did not her jealous, sore heart feel, even before he himself was conscious of the fact, that he was drawn towards sweet, lovely, composed, and dignified Ruth, one who always thought before she spoke, as Mr Farquhar used to bid Jemima do, who never was tempted by sudden impulse, but walked the world calm and self-governed. What now availed Jemima's reproaches, as she remembered the days when he had watched her with earnest, attentive eyes, as he now watched Ruth, and the times since, when, led astray by her morbid fancy, she had turned away from all his advances. "It was only in March, last March, he called me 'dear Jemima.' Ah, don't I remember it well! The pretty nosegay of greenhouse flowers that he gave me in exchange for the wild daffodils, and how he seemed to care for the flowers I gave him, and how he looked at me and thanked me. That is all gone and over now." Her sisters came in bright and glowing. "Oh, Jemima, how nice and cool you are, sitting in this shady room!" She had felt it even chilly. "We have been such a long walk. We are so tired. It is so hot." "Why did you go, then?" said she. "Oh, we wanted to go. We would not have stayed at home on any account. It has been so pleasant," said Mary. "We have been to Scaurside Wood to gather wild strawberries," said Elizabeth. "Such a quantity! We've left a whole basketful in the dairy. Mr Farquhar says he'll teach us to dress them in the way he learnt in Germany, if we can get him some hock. Do you think papa will let us have some?" "Was Mr Farquhar with you?" asked Jemima, a dull light coming into her eyes. "Yes, we told him this morning that mamma wanted us to take some old linen to the lame man at Scaurside Farm, and that we meant to coax Mrs Denbigh to let us go into the wood and gather strawberries," said Elizabeth. "I thought he would make some excuse and come," said the quick-witted Mary, as eager and thoughtless an observer of one love affair as of another, and quite forgetting that not many weeks ago she had fancied an attachment between him and Jemima. "Did you? I did not," replied Elizabeth. "At least, I never thought about it. I was quite startled when I heard his horse's feet behind us on the road. He said he was going to the farm, and could take our basket. Was it not kind of him?" Jemima did not answer, so Mary continued: "You know, it's a great pull up to the farm, and we were so hot already. The road was quite white and baked. It hurt my eyes terribly. I was so glad when Mrs Denbigh said we might turn into the wood. The light was quite green there, the branches are so thick overhead." "And there are whole beds of wild strawberries," said Elizabeth, taking up the tale now Mary was out of breath. Mary fanned herself with her bonnet, while Elizabeth went on. "You know where the grey rock crops out, don't you, Jemima? Well, there was a complete carpet of strawberry runners, so pretty, and we could hardly step without treading the little bright scarlet berries underfoot." "We did so wish for Leonard," put in Mary. "Yes, but Mrs Denbigh gathered a great many for him, and Mr Farquhar gave her all his." "I thought you said he had gone on to Dawson's farm," said Jemima. "Oh, yes! He just went up there, and then he left his horse there like a wise man, and came to us in the pretty, cool, green wood. Oh, Jemima, it was so pretty! Little flecks of light coming down here and there through the leaves, and quivering on the ground. You must go with us to morrow." "Yes," said Mary, "we're going again to morrow. We could not gather nearly all the strawberries." "And Leonard is to go too to morrow." "Yes, we thought of such a capital plan. That's to say, Mr Farquhar thought of it. We wanted to carry Leonard up the hill in a king's cushion, but Mrs Denbigh would not hear of it. She said it would tire us so, and yet she wanted him to gather strawberries." "And so," interrupted Mary, for by this time the two girls were almost speaking together, "Mr Farquhar is to bring him up before him on his horse." "You'll go with us, won't you, dear Jemima?" asked Elizabeth. "It will be at..." "No, I can't go," said Jemima abruptly. "Don't ask me. I can't." The little girls were hushed into silence by her manner; for whatever she might be to those above her in age and position, to those below her, Jemima was almost invariably gentle. She felt that they were wondering at her. "Go upstairs and take off your things. You know papa does not like you to come into this room in the shoes in which you have been out." She was glad to out her sisters short, in the details which they were so mercilessly inflicting, details which she must harden herself to, before she could hear them quietly and unmoved. She saw that she had lost her place as the first object in Mr Farquhar's eyes, a position she hardly cared for while she was secure in the enjoyment of it; but the charm of it now was redoubled, in her acute sense of how she forfeited it by her own doing, and her own fault. For if he was the cold calculating man her father had believed him to be, and had represented him as being to her, would he care for a portionless widow in humble circumstances like Mrs Denbigh? No money, no connexion, encumbered with her boy. The very action which proved Mr Farquhar to be lost to Jemima reinstated him on his throne in her fancy. And she must go on in hushed quietness, quivering with every fresh token of his preference for another. That other, too, one so infinitely more worthy of him than herself, so that she could not have even the poor comfort of thinking that he had no discrimination, and was throwing himself away on a common or worthless person. Ruth was beautiful, gentle, good, and conscientious. The hot colour flushed up into Jemima's sallow face as she became aware that, even while she acknowledged these excellences on Mrs Denbigh's part, she hated her. The recollection of her marble face wearied her even to sickness. The tones of her low voice were irritating from their very softness. Her goodness, undoubted as it was more distasteful than many faults which had more savour of human struggle in them. What was this terrible demon in her heart? asked Jemima's better angel. Was she indeed given up to possession? Was not this the old stinging hatred which had prompted so many crimes? The hatred of all sweet virtues which might win the love denied to us? The old anger that wrought in the elder brother's heart till it ended in the murder of the gentle Abel, while yet the world was young? "Oh, God, help me! I did not know I was so wicked," cried Jemima aloud in her agony. It had been a terrible glimpse into the dark, lurid gulf, the capability for evil, in her heart. She wrestled with the demon, but he would not depart. It was to be a struggle whether or not she was to be given up to him, in this her time of sore temptation. All the next day long she sat and pictured the happy strawberry gathering going on, even then, in pleasant Scarside Wood. Every touch of fancy which could heighten her idea of their enjoyment, and of Mr Farquhar's attention to the blushing, conscious Ruth, every such touch which would add a pang to her self-reproach and keen jealousy, was added to her imagination. She got up and walked about, to try and stop her over-busy fancy by bodily exercise. But she had eaten little all day, and was weak and faint in the intense heat of the sunny garden. Even the long grass walk under the filbert hedge was parched and dry in the glowing August sun. Yet her sisters found her there when they returned, walking quickly up and down, as if to warm herself on some winter's day. They were very weary, and not half so communicative as on the day before, now that Jemima was craving for every detail to add to her agony. "Yes, Leonard came up before Mr Farquhar. Oh, how hot it is, Jemima! Do sit down, and I'll tell you about it, but I can't tell if you keep walking so." "I can't sit still to day," said Jemima, springing up from the turf as soon as she had sat down. "Tell me. I can hear you while I walk about." "Oh, but I can't shout. I can hardly speak. I am so tired. Mr Farquhar brought Leonard." "You've told me that before," said Jemima sharply. "Well, I don't know what else to tell. Somebody had been since yesterday, and gathered nearly all the strawberries off the grey rock. Jemima, Jemima," said Elizabeth faintly, I am so dizzy, I think I am ill." The next minute the tired girl lay swooning on the grass. It was an outlet for Jemima's fierce energy. With a strength she had never again, and never had known before, she lifted up her fainting sister, and, bidding Mary run and clear the way, she carried her in through the open garden door, up the wide old fashioned stairs, and laid her on the bed in her own room, where the breeze from the window came softly and pleasantly through the green shade of the vine leaves and jessamine. "Give me the water. Run for mamma, Mary," said Jemima, as she saw that the fainting fit did not yield to the usual remedy of a horizontal position and water sprinkling. "Dear, dear Lizzie," said Jemima, kissing the pale, unconscious face, "I think you loved me, darling." The long walk on the hot day had been too much for the delicate Elizabeth, who was fast outgrowing her strength. It was many days before she regained any portion of her spirit and vigour. After that fainting fit she lay listless and weary, without appetite or interest, through the long, sunny autumn weather, on the bed or on the couch in Jemima's room, whither she had been carried at first. It was a comfort to Mrs Bradshaw to be able at once to discover what it was that had knocked up Elizabeth. She did not rest easily until she had settled upon a cause for every ailment or illness in the family. It was a stern consolation to Mr Bradshaw, during his time of anxiety respecting his daughter, to be able to blame somebody. He could not, like his wife, have taken comfort from an inanimate fact. He wanted the satisfaction of feeling that some one had been in fault, or else this never could have happened. Poor Ruth did not need his implied reproaches. When she saw her gentle Elizabeth lying feeble and languid, her heart blamed her for thoughtlessness so severely as to make her take all Mr Bradshaw's words and hints as too light censure for the careless way in which, to please her own child, she had allowed her two pupils to fatigue themselves with such long walks. She begged hard to take her share of nursing. Every spare moment she went to Mr Bradshaw's, and asked with earnest humility to be allowed to pass them with Elizabeth; and, as it was often a relief to have her assistance, Mrs Bradshaw received these entreaties very kindly, and desired her to go upstairs, where Elizabeth's pale countenance brightened when she saw her, but where Jemima sat in silent annoyance that her own room was now become open ground for one whom her heart rose up against to enter in and be welcomed. Whether it was that Ruth, who was not an inmate of the house, brought with her a fresher air, more change of thought to the invalid, I do not know, but Elizabeth always gave her a peculiarly tender greeting, and if she had sunk down into languid fatigue, in spite of all Jemima's endeavours to interest her, she roused up into animation when Ruth came in with a flower, a book, or a brown and ruddy pear, sending out the warm fragrance it retained from the sunny garden wall at Chapel House. The jealous dislike which Jemima was allowing to grow up in her heart against Ruth was, as she thought, never shown in word or deed. She was cold in manner because she could not be hypocritical, but her words were polite and kind in purport, and she took pains to make her actions the same as formerly. But rule and line may measure out the figure of a man. It is the soul that gives it life, and there was no soul, no inner meaning, breathing out in Jemima's actions. Ruth felt the change acutely. She suffered from it some time before she ventured to ask what had occasioned it. One day she took Miss Bradshaw by surprise, when they were alone together for a few minutes, by asking her if she had vexed her in any way, she was so changed. It is sad when friendship has cooled so far as to render such a question necessary. Jemima went rather paler than usual, and then made answer. "Changed? How do you mean? How am I changed? What do I say or do different from what I used to do?" But the tone was so constrained and cold that Ruth's heart sank within her. She knew now, as well as words could have told her, that not only had the old feeling of love passed away from Jemima, but that it had gone unregretted, and no attempt had been made to recall it. Love was very precious to Ruth now, as of old time. It was one of the faults of her nature to be ready to make any sacrifices for those who loved her, and to value affection almost above its price. She had yet to learn the lesson that it is more blessed to love than to be beloved; and lonely as the impressible years of her youth had been, without parents, without brother or sister, it was perhaps no wonder that she clung tenaciously to every symptom of regard, and could not relinquish the love of any one without a pang. The doctor, who was called in to Elizabeth, prescribed sea air as the best means of recruiting her strength. Mr Bradshaw, who liked to spend money ostentatiously, went down straight to Abermouth, and engaged a house for the remainder of the autumn; for, as he told the medical man, money was no object to him in comparison with his children's health, and the doctor cared too little about the mode in which his remedy was administered to tell Mr Bradshaw that lodgings would have done as well, or better, than the complete house he had seen fit to take; for it was now necessary to engage servants, and take much trouble which might have been obviated, and Elizabeth's removal effected more quietly and speedily, if she had gone into lodgings. As it was, she was weary of hearing all the planning and talking, and deciding and undeciding and redeciding, before it was possible for her to go. Her only comfort was in the thought that dear Mrs Denbigh was to go with her. It had not been entirely by way of pompously spending his money that Mr Bradshaw had engaged this seaside house. He was glad to get his little girls and their governess out of the way, for a busy time was impending, when he should want his head clear for electioneering purposes, and his house clear for hospitality. He was the mover of a project for bringing forward a man on the Liberal and Dissenting interest, to contest the election with the old Tory member, who had on several successive occasions walked over the course, as he and his family owned half the town, and votes and rent were paid alike to the landlord. Kings of Eccleston had Mr Cranworth and his ancestors been this many a long year. Their right was so little disputed that they never thought of acknowledging the allegiance so readily paid to them. The old feudal feeling between landowner and tenant did not quake prophetically at the introduction of manufactures. The Cranworth family ignored the growing power of the manufacturers, more especially as the principal person engaged in the trade was a dissenter. But notwithstanding this lack of patronage from the one great family in the neighbourhood, the business flourished, increased, and spread wide, and the dissenting head thereof looked around, about the time of which I speak, and felt himself powerful enough to defy the great Cranworth interest, even in their hereditary stronghold, and, by so doing, avenge the slights of many years. Slights which rankled in Mr Bradshaw's mind, as much as if he did not go to chapel twice every Sunday, and pay the largest pew rent of any member of Mr Benson's congregation. Accordingly, Mr Bradshaw had applied to one of the Liberal parliamentary agents in London, a man whose only principle was to do wrong on the Liberal side. He would not act right or wrong for a Tory, but for a Whig the latitude of his conscience had never yet been discovered. It was possible Mr Bradshaw was not aware of the character of this agent; at any rate, he knew he was the man for his purpose, which was to hear of some one who would come forward as a candidate for the representation of Eccleston on the dissenting interest. There are in round numbers about 600 voters," said he. 200 are decidedly in the Cranworth interest. Dare not offend Mr. Cranworth, poor souls. 200 more we may calculate upon as pretty certain factory hands, or people connected with our trade in some way or another, who are indignant at the stubborn way in which Cranworth has contested the right of water. 200 are doubtful. "Don't much care either way," said the parliamentary agent. "Of course we must make them care." Mr Bradshaw rather shrank from the knowing look with which this was said. He hoped that Mr Pilson did not mean to allude to bribery, but he did not express this hope, because he thought it would deter the agent from using this means, and it was possible it might prove to be the only way. And if he, Mr Bradshaw, once embarked on such an enterprise, there must be no failure. By some expedient or another, success must be certain, or he could have nothing to do with it. The parliamentary agent was well accustomed to deal with all kinds and shades of scruples. He was most at home with men who had none, but still he could allow for human weakness, and he perfectly understood Mr Bradshaw. "I have a notion, I know, of a man who will just suit your purpose. Plenty of money, does not know what to do with it. In fact, tired of yachting, travelling, wants something new. I heard, through some of the means of intelligence I employ, that not very long ago he was wishing for a seat in Parliament." "A Liberal?" said Mr Bradshaw. "Decidedly. Belongs to a family who were in the Long Parliament in their day." Mr Bradshaw rubbed his hands. "Dissenter?" asked he. No, not so far as that, but very lax Church." "What is his name?" asked Mr Bradshaw, eagerly. "Excuse me. Until I am certain that he would like to come forward for Eccleston, I think I had better not mention his name." The anonymous gentleman did like to come forward, and his name proved to be Donne. He and Mr Bradshaw had been in correspondence during all the time of Mr Ralph Cranworth's illness, and when he died, everything was arranged ready for a start, even before the Cranworths had determined who should keep the seat warm till the eldest son came of age, for the father was already member for the county. Mr Donne was to come down to canvass in person, and was to take up his abode at Mr Bradshaw's, and therefore it was that the seaside house, within 20 miles distance of Eccleston, was found to be so convenient as an infirmary and nursery for those members of his family who were likely to be useless, if not positive encumbrances, during the forthcoming election. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 22. The Liberal Candidate and his Precursor. Jemima did not know whether she wished to go to Abermouth or not. She longed for change. She wearied of the sights and sounds of home. But yet she could not bear to leave the neighbourhood of Mr Farquhar, especially as, if she went to Abermouth, Ruth would in all probability be left to take her holiday at home. When Mr Bradshaw decided that she was to go, Ruth tried to feel glad that he gave her the means of repairing her fault towards Elizabeth, and she resolved to watch over the two girls most faithfully and carefully, and to do all in her power to restore the invalid to health. But a tremor came over her whenever she thought of leaving Leonard. She had never quitted him for a day, and it seemed to her as if her brooding, constant care was his natural and necessary shelter from all evils, from very death itself. She would not go to sleep at nights, in order to enjoy the blessed consciousness of having him near her. When she was away from him teaching her pupils, she kept trying to remember his face, and print it deep on her heart against the time when days and days would elapse without her seeing that little darling countenance. Miss Benson would wonder to her brother that Mr Bradshaw did not propose that Leonard should accompany his mother. He only begged her not to put such an idea into Ruth's head, as he was sure Mr Bradshaw had no thoughts of doing any such thing. Yet to Ruth it might be a hope, and then a disappointment. His sister scolded him for being so cold-hearted, but he was full of sympathy, although he did not express it, and made some quiet little sacrifices in order to set himself at liberty to take Leonard a long walking expedition on the day when his mother left Eccleston. Ruth cried until she could cry no longer, and felt very much ashamed of herself as she saw the grave and wondering looks of her pupils, whose only feeling on leaving home was delight at the idea of Abermouth, and into whose minds the possibility of death to any of their beloved ones never entered. Ruth dried her eyes, and spoke cheerfully as soon as she caught the perplexed expression of their faces, and by the time they arrived at Abermouth, she was as much delighted with all the new scenery as they were, and found it hard work to resist their entreaties to go rambling out on the seashore at once. But Elizabeth had undergone more fatigue that day than she had had before for many weeks, and Ruth was determined to be prudent. Meanwhile, the Bradshaws' house at Eccleston was being rapidly adapted for electioneering hospitality. The partition wall between the unused drawing room and the schoolroom was broken down, in order to admit of folding doors. The ingenious upholsterer of the town (and what town does not boast of the upholsterer full of contrivances and resources, in opposition to the upholsterer of steady capital and no imagination, who looks down with uneasy contempt on ingenuity) had come in to give his opinion that nothing could be easier than to convert a bathroom into a bedroom by the assistance of a little drapery to conceal the shower bath, the string of which was to be carefully concealed, for fear that the unconscious occupier of the bath bed might innocently take it for a bell rope. The professional cook of the town had been already engaged to take up her abode for a month at Mr Bradshaw's, much to the indignation of Betsy, who became a vehement partisan of Mr Cranworth. As soon as ever she heard of the plan of her deposition from sovereign authority in the kitchen, in which she had reigned supreme for 14 years, Mrs Bradshaw sighed and bemoaned herself in all her leisure moments, which were not many, and wondered why their house was to be turned into an inn for this Mr Donne, when everybody knew that the George was good enough for the Cranworths, who never thought of asking the electors to the hall; and they had lived at Cranworth ever since Julius Caesar's time, and if that was not being an old family, she did not know what was. The excitement soothed Jemima. There was something to do. It was she who planned with the upholsterer. It was she who soothed Betsy into angry silence. It was she who persuaded her mother to lie down and rest, while she herself went out to buy the heterogeneous things required to make the family and house presentable to Mr Donne and his precursor, the friend of the parliamentary agent. This latter gentleman never appeared himself on the scene of action, but pulled all the strings notwithstanding. The friend was a Mr Hickson, a lawyer, a briefless barrister, some people called him; but he himself professed a great disgust to the law, as a great sham, which involved an immensity of underhanded action, and truckling, and time-serving, and was perfectly encumbered by useless forms and ceremonies, and dead obsolete words. So, instead of putting his shoulder to the wheel to reform the law. He talked eloquently against it, in such a high priest style that it was occasionally a matter of surprise how he could ever have made a friend of the parliamentary agent before mentioned. But, as Mr. Hickson himself said, it was the very corruptness of the law which he was fighting against, in doing all he could to effect the return of certain members to Parliament, these certain members being pledged to effect a reform in the law, according to Mr. Hickson. And, as he once observed confidentially, if you had to destroy a hydra-headed monster, would you measure swords with the demon as if he were a gentleman? Would you not rather seize the first weapon that came to hand? And so do I. My great object in life, sir, is to reform the law of England, sir. Once get a majority of Liberal members into the House, and the thing is done. And I consider myself justified, for so high, for, I may say, so holy an end, in using men's weaknesses to work out my purpose. Of course, if men were angels, or even immaculate, men invulnerable to bribes, we would not bribe. "Could you?" asked Jemima, for the conversation took place at Mr. Bradshaw's dinner table, where a few friends were gathered together to meet Mr. Hickson, and among them was Mr. Benson. "We neither would nor could," said the ardent barrister, disregarding, in his vehemence, the point of the question, and floating on over the bar of argument into the wide ocean of his own eloquence. "As it is, as the world stands, they who would succeed even in good deeds must come down to the level of expediency; and therefore, I say once more, if Mr. Donne is the man for your purpose, and your purpose is a good one, a lofty one, a holy one," for Mr. Hickson remembered the dissenting character of his little audience, and privately considered the introduction of the word holy a most happy hit, "then, I say, we must put all the squeamish scruples which might befit Utopia, or some such place, on one side, and treat men as they are. If they are avaricious, it is not we who have made them so, but as we have to do with them, we must consider their failings in dealing with them. If they had been careless or extravagant, or have had their little peccadilloes, we must administer the screw. The glorious reform of the law will justify, in my idea, all means to obtain the end. That law, from the profession of which I have withdrawn myself from perhaps a too scrupulous conscience," he concluded softly to himself. "We are not to do evil that good may come," said Mr. Benson. He was startled at the deep sound of his own voice as he uttered these words. But he had not been speaking for some time, and his voice came forth strong and unmodulated. "True, sir, most true," said Mr. Hickson, bowing. "I honour you for the observation." And he profited by it, in so much that he confined his further remarks on elections to the end of the table, where he sat near Mr. Bradshaw, and one or two equally eager, though not equally influential partisans of Mr. Donne's. Meanwhile, Mr. Farquhar took up Mr. Benson's quotation at the end, where he and Jemima sat down near to Mrs. Bradshaw and him. But in the present state of the world, as Mr. Hickson says, it is rather difficult to act upon that precept. "Oh, Mr. Farquhar!" said Jemima indignantly, the tears springing to her eyes with a feeling of disappointment, for she had been chafing under all that Mr. Hickson had been saying, perhaps the more for one or two attempts on his part at flirtation with the daughter of his wealthy host, which she resented with all the loathing of a preoccupied heart. And she had longed to be a man, to speak out her wrath at this paltering with right and wrong. She had felt grateful to Mr. Benson for his one clear, short precept, coming down with a divine force against which there was no appeal, and now to have Mr Farquhar taking the side of expediency. It was too bad. "Nay, Jemima," said Mr Farquhar, touched and secretly flattered by the visible pain his speech had given. "Don't be indignant with me till I have explained myself a little more. I don't understand myself yet, and it is a very intricate question, or so it appears to me, which I was going to put, really, earnestly, and humbly, for Mr Benson's opinion. Now, Mr Benson, may I ask if you always find it practicable to act strictly in accordance with that principle? For if you do not, I am sure no man living can. Are there not occasions when it is absolutely necessary to wade through evil to good? I am not speaking in the careless, presumptuous way of that man yonder," said he, lowering his voice, and addressing himself to Jemima more exclusively. "I am really anxious to hear what Mr Benson will say on the subject, for I know no one to whose candid opinion I should attach more weight." But Mr Benson was silent. He did not see Mrs Bradshaw and Jemima leave the room. He was really, as Mr Farquhar supposed him, completely absent, questioning himself as to how far his practice tallied with his principle. By degrees he came to himself. He found the conversation still turned on the election, and Mr Hickson, who felt that he had jarred against the little minister's principles, and yet knew, from the carte du pays which the scouts of the parliamentary agent had given him, that Mr Benson was a person to be conciliated, on account of his influence over many of the working people, began to ask him questions with an air of deferring to superior knowledge that almost surprised Mr Bradshaw, who had been accustomed to treat Benson in a very different fashion, of civil condescending indulgence, just as one listens to a child who can have no opportunities of knowing better. At the end of a conversation that Mr Hickson held with Mr Benson, on a subject in which the latter was really interested, and on which he had expressed himself at some length, the young barrister turned to Mr Bradshaw, and said very audibly: "I wish Donne had been here. This conversation during the last half hour would have interested him almost as much as it has done me." Mr Bradshaw little guessed the truth, that Mr Donne was, at that very moment, coaching up the various subjects of public interest at Eccleston, and privately cursing the particular subject on which Mr Benson had been holding forth, as being an unintelligible piece of quixotism, or the leading dissenter of the town need not have experienced a pang of jealousy at the possible future admiration his minister might excite in the possible future member for Eccleston. And if Mr Benson had been clairvoyant, he need not have made an especial subject of gratitude out of the likelihood that he might have an opportunity of so far interesting Mr Donne in the condition of the people of Eccleston, as to induce him to set his face against any attempts at bribery. Mr Benson thought of this half the night through, and ended by determining to write a sermon on the Christian view of political duties, which might be good for all, both electors and member, to hear on the eve of an election; for Mr Donne was expected at Mr Bradshaw's before the next Sunday, and, of course, as Mr and Miss Benson had settled it, he would appear at the chapel with them on that day. But the stinging conscience refused to be quieted. No present plan of usefulness allayed the aching remembrance of the evil he had done that good might come. Not even the look of Leonard, as the early dawn fell on him, and Mr Benson's sleepless eyes saw the rosy glow on his firm, round cheeks, his open mouth, through which the soft, long-drawn breath came gently quivering, and his eyes not fully shut, but closed to outward sight. Not even the aspect of the quiet, innocent child could soothe the troubled spirit. Leonard and his mother dreamt of each other that night. Her dream of him was one of undefined terror, terror so great that it wakened her up, and she strove not to sleep again, for fear that ominous, ghastly dream should return. He, on the contrary, dreamt of her sitting, watching, and smiling by his bedside, as her gentle self had been many a morning; and when she saw him awake, so it fell out in the dream, she smiled still more sweetly, and bending down she kissed him, and then spread out large, soft, white feathered wings, which in no way surprised her child. He seemed to have known they were there all along, and sailed away through the open window far into the blue sky of a summer's day. Leonard wakened up then, and remembered how far away she really was, far more distant and inaccessible than the beautiful blue sky to which she had betaken herself in his dream, and cried himself to sleep again. In spite of her absence from her child, which made one great and abiding sorrow, Ruth enjoyed her seaside visit exceedingly. In the first place, there was the delight of seeing Elizabeth's daily and almost hourly improvement. Then, at the doctor's express orders, there were so few lessons to be done, that there was time for the long exploring rambles which all three delighted in; and when the rain came on and the storms blew, the house, with its wild sea views, was equally delightful. It was a large house, built on the summit of a rock, which nearly overhung the shore below. There was, to be sure, a series of zigzag tacking paths down the face of this rock, but from the house they could not be seen. Old or delicate people would have considered the situation bleak and exposed. Indeed, the present proprietor wanted to dispose of it on this very account; but by its present inhabitants this exposure and bleakness was called by other names, and considered as charms. From every part of the rooms they saw the grey storms gather on the sea horizon, and put themselves in marching array. And soon the march became a sweep, and the great dome of the heavens was covered with the lurid clouds, between which, and the vivid green earth below, there seemed to come a purple atmosphere, making the very threatening beautiful; and by the house was wrapped in sheets of rain, shutting out sky and sea and inland view, till of a sudden the storm was gone by, and the heavy raindrops glistened in the sun as they hung on leaf and grass, and the little birds sang east, and the little birds sang west, and there was a pleasant sound of running waters all abroad. "Oh, if papa would but buy this house!" exclaimed Elizabeth, after one such storm, which she had watched silently from the very beginning of the little cloud no bigger than a man's hand. "Mamma would never like it, I am afraid," said Mary. "She would call our delicious gushes of air draughts, and think we should catch cold. Jemima would be on our side; but how long Mrs Denbigh is! I hope she was near enough to the post office when the rain came on." Ruth had gone to the shop in the little village, about half a mile distant, where all the letters were left till fetched. She only expected one, but that one was to tell her of Leonard. She, however, received two. The unexpected one was from Mr Bradshaw, and the news it contained was, if possible, a greater surprise than the letter itself. Mr Bradshaw informed her that he planned arriving by dinner time the following Saturday at Eagle's Crag, and more, that he intended bringing Mr Donne and one or two other gentlemen with him, to spend the Sunday there. The letter went on to give every possible direction regarding the household preparations. The dinner hour was fixed to be at 6; but, of course, Ruth and the girls would have dined long before. The professional cook would arrive the day before, laden with all the provisions that could not be obtained on the spot. Ruth was to engage a waiter from the inn, and this it was that detained her so long. While she sat in the little parlour, awaiting the coming of the landlady, she could not help wondering why Mr Bradshaw was bringing this strange gentleman to spend 2 days at Abermouth, and thus giving himself so much trouble and fuss of preparation. There were so many small reasons that went to make up the large one which had convinced Mr Bradshaw of the desirableness of this step, that it was not likely that Ruth should guess at one half of them. In the first place, Miss Benson, in the pride and fullness of her heart, had told Mrs Bradshaw what her brother had told her, how he meant to preach upon the Christian view of the duties involved in political rights. And as, of course, Mrs Bradshaw had told Mr Bradshaw, he began to dislike the idea of attending chapel on that Sunday at all, for he had an uncomfortable idea that by the Christian standard, that divine test of the true and pure, bribery would not be altogether approved of, and yet he was tacitly coming round to the understanding that packets would be required, for what purpose both he and Mr Donne were to be supposed to remain ignorant. But it would be very awkward, so near to the time, if he were to be clearly convinced that bribery, however disguised by names and words, was in plain terms a sin. And yet he knew Mr Benson had once or twice convinced him against his will of certain things, which he had thenceforward found it impossible to do, without such great uneasiness of mind, that he had left off doing them, which was sadly against his interest. And if Mr Donne, whom he had intended to take with him to chapel, as fair dissenting prey, should also become convinced, why, the Cranworths would win the day, and he should be the laughing-stock of Eccleston. No, in this one case bribery must be allowed, was allowable. But it was a great pity human nature was so corrupt, and if his member succeeded, he would double his subscription to the schools, in order that the next generation might be taught better. There were various other reasons which strengthened Mr Bradshaw in the bright idea of going down to Abermouth for the Sunday. Some connected with the out-of-door politics, and some with the domestic. For instance, it had been the plan of the house to have a cold dinner on the Sunday. Mr Bradshaw had piqued himself on this strictness, and yet he had instinctive feeling that Mr Donne was not quite the man to partake of cold meat for conscience' sake with cheerful indifference to his fare. Mr Donne had, in fact, taken the Bradshaw household a little by surprise. Before he came, Mr Bradshaw had pleased himself with thinking that more unlikely things had happened than the espousal of his daughter with the member of a small borough. But this pretty airy bubble burst as soon as he saw Mr Donne, and its very existence was forgotten in less than half an hour, when he felt the quiet but incontestable difference of rank and standard that there was, in every respect, between his guest and his own family. It was not through any circumstance so palpable and possibly accidental as the bringing down a servant, who Mr Donne seemed to consider as much a matter of course as a carpet-bag, though the smart gentleman's arrival fluttered the Volscians in Caroli considerably more than his gentle-spoken master's. It was nothing like this. It was something indescribable, a quiet being at ease, and expecting every one else to be so. An attention to women, which was so habitual as to be unconsciously exercised to those subordinate persons in Mr Bradshaw's family. A happy choice of simple and expressive words, some of which, it must be confessed, were slang, but fashionable slang, and that makes all the difference. A measured, graceful way of utterance, with a style of pronunciation quite different to that of Eccleston. All these put together make but a part of the indescribable whole which unconsciously affected Mr Bradshaw, and established Mr Donne in his estimation as a creature quite different to any he had seen before, and as most unfit to mate with Jemima. Mr Hickson, who had appeared as a model of gentlemanly ease before Mr Donne's arrival, now became vulgar and coarse in Mr Bradshaw's eyes; and yet such was the charm of that languid, high-bred manner, that Mr Bradshaw "cottoned," as he expressed it to Mr Farquhar, to his new candidate at once. He was only afraid lest Mr Donne was too indifferent to all things under the sun to care whether he gained or lost the election; but he was reassured after the first conversation they had together on the subject. Mr Donne's eye lightened with an eagerness that was almost fierce, though his tones were as musical and nearly as slow as ever. When Mr Bradshaw alluded distantly to probable expenses and packets, Mr Donne replied, "Oh, of course, disagreeable necessity. Better speak as little about such things as possible. Other people can be found to arrange all the dirty work. Neither you nor I would like to soil our fingers by it, I am sure. £4,000 are in Mr Pilson's hands, and I shall never inquire what becomes of them. They may very probably be absorbed in the law expenses, you know. I shall let it be clearly understood from the hustings that I most decidedly disapprove of bribery, and leave the rest to Hickson's management. He is accustomed to these sort of things. I am not." Mr Bradshaw was rather perplexed by this want of bustling energy on the part of the new candidate, and if it had not been for the £4,000 aforesaid, would have doubted whether Mr Donne cared sufficiently for the result of the election. Jemima thought differently. She watched her father's visitor attentively, with something like the curious observation which a naturalist bestows on a new species of animal. "Do you know what Mr Donne reminds me of, mamma?" said she, one day, as the two sat at work, while the gentlemen were absent canvassing. "No, he is not like anybody I ever saw. He quite frightens me, by being so ready to open the door for me if I am going out of the room, and by giving me a chair when I come in. I never saw any one like him. Who is it, Jemima?" "Not any person, not any human being, mamma," said Jemima, half smiling. "Do you remember our stopping at Wakefield once, on our way to Scarborough? And there were horse races going on somewhere, and some of the racers were in the stables at the inn where we dined?" "Yes, I remember it. But what about that?" "Why, Richard, somehow, knew one of the jockeys, and as we were coming in from our ramble throughout the town, this man, or boy, asked us to look at one of the racers he had the charge of." "Well, my dear?" "Well, mamma, Mr Donne is like that horse." "Nonsense, Jemima! You must not say so. I don't know what your father would say if he heard you likening Mr Donne to a brute." "Brutes are sometimes very beautiful, mamma. I am sure I should think it a compliment to be likened to a racehorse, such as the one we saw. But the thing in which they are alike is the sort of repressed eagerness in both." "Eager! Why, I should say there never was any one cooler than Mr Donne. Think of the trouble your papa had this month past, and then remember the slow way in which Mr Donne moves when he is going out to canvass, and the low, drawling voice in which he questions the people who bring him intelligence. I can see your papa standing by, ready to shake them to get out their news." "But Mr Donne's questions are always to the point, and force out the grain without the chaff. And look at him, if any one tells him ill news about the election. Have you never seen a dull red light come into his eyes? That is like my racehorse." Her flesh quivered all over at certain sounds and noises which had some meaning to her, but she stood quite still, pretty creature. Now, Mr Donne is just as eager as she was, though he may be too proud to show it. Though he seems so gentle, I almost think he is very headstrong in following out his own will." "Well, don't call him like a horse again, for I am sure papa would not like it. Do you know, I thought you were going to say he was like little Leonard, when you asked me who he was like." "Leonard! Oh, mamma! He is not in the least like Leonard. He is 20 times more like my racehorse." "Now, my dear Jemima, do be quiet. Your father thinks racing so wrong, that I am sure he would be very seriously displeased if he were to hear you." To return to Mr Bradshaw, and to give one more of his various reasons for wishing to take Mr Donne to Abermouth. The wealthy Eccleston manufacturer was uncomfortably impressed with an indefinable sense of inferiority to his visitor. It was not in education, for Mr Bradshaw was a well-educated man. It was not in power, for, if he chose, the present object of Mr Donne's life might be utterly defeated. It did not arise from anything overbearing in manner, for Mr Donne was habitually polite and courteous, and was just now anxious to propitiate his host, whom he looked upon as a very useful man. Whatever this sense of inferiority arose from, Mr Bradshaw was anxious to relieve himself from it, and imagined that if he could make more display of his wealth, his object would be obtained. Now, his house in Eccleston was old-fashioned and ill-calculated to exhibit money's worth. His mode of living, though strained to a high pitch just at this time, he became aware, was no more than Mr Donne was accustomed to every day of his life. The first day, at dessert, some opportune remark, as Mr Bradshaw, in his innocence, had thought, was made regarding the price of pineapples, which was rather exorbitant that year, and Mr Donne asked Mrs Bradshaw, with quiet surprise, if they had no pinery, as if to be without a pinery were indeed a depth of pitiable destitution. In fact, Mr Donne had been born and cradled in all that wealth could purchase, and so had his ancestors before him for so many generations, that refinement and luxury seemed the natural condition of man, and they that dwelt without were in the position of monsters. The absence was noticed, but not the presence. Now, Mr Bradshaw knew that the house and grounds of Eagle's Crag were exorbitantly dear, and yet he really thought of purchasing them. And as one means of exhibiting his wealth, and so raising himself up to the level of Mr Donne, he thought that if he could take the latter down to Abermouth, and show him the place for which, because his little girls had taken a fancy to it, he was willing to give the fancy price of £14,000, he should, at last, make those half-shut dreamy eyes open wide, and their owner confess that, in wealth at least, the Eccleston manufacturer stood on a par with him. All these mingled motives caused the determination which made Ruth sit in the little inn parlour of Abermouth during the wild storm's passage. She wondered if she had fulfilled all Mr Bradshaw's directions. She looked at the letter. Yes, everything was done, and now home with her news, through the wet lane, where the little pools by the roadside reflected the deep blue sky and the round white clouds, with even deeper blue and clearer white, and the raindrops hung so thick on the trees that even a little bird's flight was enough to shake them down in a bright shower as of rain. When she told the news, Mary exclaimed, "Oh, how charming! Then we shall see this new member after all," while Elizabeth added, "Yes, I shall like to do that. But where must we be? Papa will want the dining room, and this room, and where must we sit?" "Oh," said Ruth, "in the dressing room next to my room. All that your papa wants always is that you are quiet and out of the way." CHAPTER 22